And without any further ado, Monica, whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for having me tonight. We can just go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, I want to start out just talking briefly about pollinators as a basis for why we're concerned about developing pollinator habitat. First of all, because plants can't move, they have to rely on an animal in order to transfer their pollen, which is the male part of the plant, to the female part of the plant, in a process called pollination. And almost 90%, so more than 85%, but closer to 90% of flowering plants require an animal, and that's mostly insects for pollination. And after the plant then is fertilized, it can produce either a seed or a fruit. And those seeds and fruits are really important for countless wildlife species, everything from birds to grizzly bears and to humans. And you can see on this photo here the pollen on the rear leg of the bee, and that's where it's picked up and transferred from flower to flower. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, about 2/3 of the world's crop species depend on insects for pollination, and that accounts for about 35% of all crops that are produced. And in the United States alone, we have over 100 different crop plants that either need or benefit from a pollinator insect. And that accounts for about $18 to $27 billion in the value of crops in the United States alone. And really importantly, a lot of the plants that are pollinated by insects are the foods that we need to get most of our vitamins and minerals, all the different fruits and vegetables. So without pollinator insects, we would rely only on wind-pollinated or self-pollinated plants for our diet, and that would be plants like wheat or corn. Next slide. Most of us, when we think about bees, we think about the honeybee, which is an exotic bee. It was introduced to the United States, but North America also has approximately 4,000 species of native bees. And we know that in Montana, we have somewhere in the hundreds of species of native bees. We know we have at least 28 different species of bumblebees. And they're all really important for pollination. And they contribute about $3 billion a year to the US economy in our pollination services that they provide. Next slide. So unfortunately, there's been decline in pollinators, both native species and the honeybee. A lot of what we know is about the decline is from the honeybee because it's managed hives, and we know that about 50% decline of the number of managed hives has happened since 1950. And beekeepers have been experiencing losses of 22% to 45% annually in their beehives and bee numbers since 2006. And at the same time, we have a doubling of the cropland that's requires bee pollination. So some of the causes of decline include disease and pests. And you can see on this photo, there's a varroa mite attached to the back of this bee. Pesticide exposure, and then loss of habitat is another factor in decline. Next slide. Fortunately, we can easily develop or enhance pollinator habitat, and it really requires a few main specifications, and that is that we have a diversity of plants. We want to have different species there that flower throughout the growing season so that they can provide a pollen source for bees and other pollinator insects throughout the growing season. We need to pick a good site that pollinators have places not only for collecting pollen, but also have nesting material available. and make sure that that environment is free of pesticides that could harm them. Okay, next slide. So we're going to focus tonight on seedbed preparation for before you're planting your pollinator garden. And we're focusing on it because it really is the most important step in the seeding process. We find that if you have good site prep, you're going to have a much higher likelihood of success. The more you put into developing that site is really going to serve you well. So what you do for site prep is really going to depend on what your site looks like, what species you have there right now, and what kind of equipment you have. But one of the most important things is to control the weeds on the site. And in some cases, the weeds might just be the existing vegetation. If it's already in grass or some other vegetation, you just want to make sure to remove all that before you seed your pollinator mix. And you want to create what we call a safe site. So on the picture on the right, you can see the seed embedded in the soil, and that's in an area that provides some safety from different hazards. It's not going to wash away, it's not going to blow away, it's in good contact with the soil, and that's what we really need to have good I'm sorry. And then in the picture on the left, you can see there's lots of good texture in that soil, and that's going to be important for capturing water and nutrients and provide resources for your germinating seeds. Next slide, please. Okay, so before seeding, you want to make sure that your area is prepped. And you can do that in a variety of different ways to remove the existing vegetation. So one of the ways might be combining using a chemical and a tillage, or you might use tillage only or solarization. And we're going to talk about all of these tonight. Some of the other things you want to do on the site is once you've broken up the soil and you're removing your grass, we want to make sure that we don't leave really big clods of dirt. We want to have a pretty uniform seed bed. And one of our rules of thumb is that when you walk across the site, your footprint in the soil should not sink any deeper than about a ½ inch into the ground. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about a few different options that you can do for site prep. If you're interested in using a chemical, you can use glyphosate, which is Roundup. And Roundup, once it hits the soil, is inert, so it's not going to have a long-lasting activity in the soil and affect your plants once you've seeded. You need to apply it when the plants are actively growing, so it needs to be about 55 degrees or warmer outside so that it'll be effective. And once you apply it, really allow about 2 weeks for it to really work through the plants, kill the roots. Usually takes that long to see some good results. And if you have a lot of existing vegetation, especially if you have a lot of deep-rooted grasses or something on the site, you might have to repeat that a couple times. So whether or not you use Roundup, you can also use that with turning your soil, or you can just use turning your soil as your site prep. And some of the tools you might use for this are a rototiller or just a shovel and turn the soil. And you can see an example of that in this photo here. You can see they just broke up the sod and turned it over. But one really important thing about this, so if you haven't killed the roots with like using Roundup on the site, then it's going to be really important to rake out the roots, break up the soil, and just make sure you're removing all the live roots from the soil, so you're not going to have a lot of competition with your seeded species. And I would do that a few times. In fact, if you're going to use it, like turning the soil as your main site prep, I would do it several times throughout the growing season this summer, and then maybe consider seeding into the fall, because the more work you can put into decreasing the competitive vegetation, the better off your planting is going to turn out. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, like I mentioned, there's this really fine balance between having a seed bed that's too firm that you won't be able to seed into. Remember that our seed needs to get about a half an inch down into the soil. So we don't want it just sitting on the soil surface. We want the soil loose enough that the seed will sprout and the root can penetrate into the soil. But we want to have the soil then light enough that it's going to allow water to infiltrate air. We need to get oxygen to our roots and into the soil, so that's really important too. And then just that uniform firmness that I talked about. So if you're breaking up the soil with a shovel and removing roots, make sure to break up all those big clods of soil. And doing all of this again will help allow for proper seeding depth. And just that rule of thumb again, think about when you walk across the site, your footprint should sink about a ½ inch into the soil. And the photo on the right, I put that in because there's different tools you can use with your four-wheeler. This is a site that we seeded, and then we wanted to make sure that the soil was firmed up a little and wasn't going to blow away with our seed. So we rolled the site to help firm the soil surface a little bit. Okay, next slide. And I just threw this in there because for the folks that are putting together a larger pollinator plot, I just wanted you to know that there's some really neat implements out there that you can get for your four-wheeler, from sprayers to little disc tillers and broadcast seeders, and you might have those available locally, or I've even seen these for sale in the Cabela's catalog. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next thing for site prep is important to have soil moisture near the soil surface. So remember that we need to have moisture there to germinate the seed and provide the moisture to grow. And you're going to want to make sure too that your soil profile has moisture throughout it. So as your root is elongating, it continues to have moisture available for growth. So these conditions are what we would naturally find in the early spring. If you want to seed in the early spring, we suggest you seed before May 15th to make sure there's adequate moisture and it's not going to dry out too quickly. Another time that we recommend seeding is a fall dormant seeding. So by this, I mean that you want to seed after May or after October 15th. So the idea is that you don't want to germinate the seed until spring. You want to put it in the soil and then allow it to sit there through winter, let the soil recharge with the moisture, and then in the spring when the temperature warms up and the soils warm up, it'll start to grow and it'll have the moisture available throughout the soil for its growth. Since a lot of the plots that you're putting in are smaller, if you can apply irrigation for the first 2 months or longer, it'll really help benefit your planting. And this is a picture of a pollinator planting in Wyoming that we put in. And it was a flood irrigated site, and I had never seen the black-eyed Susan established as well as on this site. But there was also a lot of diversity of other species in that site, but I thought that was a pretty great establishment. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we talked about starting with a weed-free bed, really important. The most important step is your site prep. But we have to also remember that it's really important to continue to manage your weeds throughout the establishment of your pollinator plot. And a few ways to do that are mowing. And you can see on these plots, they're put in existing vegetation. So there's a lawn or there's a natural area. And one of the things I do in my pollinator plot is just mow around the perimeter so you can see if grass or other weeds are starting to encroach. And then you can easily hand pull those or spot treat them as it's getting into the site so it doesn't get too bad. If other weeds are showing up throughout your pollinator plot, especially when you have small seedlings, be sure to get out there and just do some hand pulling. Hopefully your soil's nice and loose, and so your plants will pull out easily. But if you have a maybe a deeper tap-rooted plant like Canada thistle moving into the site, then you might just be able to spot spray that individual plant with some Roundup to make sure that you get the roots out of that system too. But if you do that, just really be sure that you're not getting it on any of your other seeded species. Okay, next slide. Another important thing for managing your pollinator plot is to prevent grazing on the site. So if you have a larger site and you have some livestock, just make sure you're keeping the livestock out of that site, or even deer out of that site. And you can do that with some temporary fence or electric fence until the plants get going, because the young plants are really susceptible to grazing. They're highly palatable. A lot of the pollinator plants too are really nutritious plants that are used for forage. And then there's going to be some plants in there like blanket flower that are native plants and great pollinator plants, but they resist grazing more naturally. They're just not as attractive to other grazers. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just some tips that we talked about tonight. First of all, really important to reduce weed competition before you're seeding your site. So remember, again, the weeds on your site might just be the existing lawn or the grasses that are there, but anything that's going to compete with your seed, make sure that you remove that from site. And then make sure you have a uniformly firm seed bed. So the picture on the top is where the site's been prepped and someone's walked across it, and you can see the footprints are a ½ inch into the soil compared to down at the bottom where it's just really too soft, and your seed is going to get lost in the soil, but more importantly, it's just going to cause a lot of drying out of your soil profile and your seed. So the next tip was to keep moisture near the soil surface when we're trying to germinate our species. And a lot of that can just be done by seeding at the right time of the year. Another tip is to get good quality seed, which is what's going to be provided to you from Lake County. And then make sure you're working on your ongoing management. So your weed control, you're minimizing grazing, and you're doing whatever you can, if you can irrigate, to help promote the pollinator plants that you just seeded. Okay, and that's the last slide I had. And we can transition to Ben's presentation.
Awesome, Ben, whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Monica. So I'm just going to touch on a few things that are maybe more specific to our county, some of the challenges that people locally have had that I've seen, and maybe help troubleshoot some of the issues that we've had. So the first thing in our county, one problem people most often have is competition within their seeding. And as Monica said, site prep is #1 most important thing. I can't highlight it enough. Underline it, bold it, exclamation point. Having a clean, weed-free site is critically important for the success of any seeding. And so we're going to talk really briefly here about one of the more common challenges we have with keeping a site clean and weed-free. And what we're going to talk about is rhizominous grasses. And so these are very common grasses that we have in our county, and they're widely distributed across all of Montana and all of the West. But I can pretty much guarantee you that everybody listening to this call has those grasses near or within the plot where they're going to put their species. So I just want to highlight what those are and how we can do our best to minimize the impact that they have. So go to the next slide, please. So what are rhizomes? Well, they're basically just a continuous growing shoot that comes off of the grass and goes horizontally right under or sometimes on top of the soil surface. And from that shoot, the grass can send up multiple other grass plants or roots, depending on what it needs, all along that horizontal shoot. And so you've experienced this if you've gardened and you've pulled on a piece of grass and it seems to pull up like a string and it just keeps coming and coming and coming until you eventually break the rhizome. And so what that is it is a rhizome, and anywhere along that string, that horizontal stem, that plant can send up additional plants. So if you just till a site that has a lot of these rhizomatous grasses, you're basically chopping up that stem into lots of little pieces that can then regenerate into additional grass plants. So in a way, you're almost spurring it on and encouraging it to create lots of additional grasses from what was one rhizomatous stem, if that makes sense. So that's why sometimes tillage alone isn't enough to get rid of these rhizomatous grasses, because they actually kind of like it to a certain degree, right? You stir them up, you chop them up, and then you see a bunch of new little shoots coming up all over the place that you just previously tilled. And so we needed to just make sure we take that into account. And so, as Monica said, if you till, you definitely want to try and do that multiple times to exhaust the supply of those stems. So if you till it once and chop them up into little pieces, all those little pieces send up new shoots for grass to grow. If you till it again, right after those shoots start to come out of the ground, that can kind of exhaust the reserves that are within that stem, that rhizome, and hopefully prevent it from keeping over again, right? And it helps to till it, sometimes even more than twice. So sometimes to really exhaust the supply of those rhizomes, you need to till it 3, 4, 5 times. And I'm not telling you that you have to do that, right? But I would certainly, like Monica said, if I'm only using tillage, I would use tillage, more than just once. I would till and then wait 10 days to 2 weeks or so until you see some germination on the soil surface. That would be either these rhizomatous grasses reforming, or a lot of times there's just additional seeds in the seed bank that are going to be, brought closer to the surface and going to germinate. And then tilling again can kind of terminate those and, at least exhaust some of the supply of competition within your seed bank. And so there on those pictures, you see just 2 examples of those rhizomes. And let's go to the next slide. And then this is a smooth brome patch, and this is pretty common in Lake County. There's a lot of smooth brome. So the common rhizomatous grasses you're going to find is going to be quackgrass, Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, and there's others out there for sure. But these are the common ones. And the problem with these rhizomatous grasses, the reason we care about them, the reason they are difficult to plant into, is because they form what's called monocultures. A monoculture is basically a stand of only one species, and that is that these grasses are aggressive enough that they can crowd out all the existing competition and make it hard for other plants to survive within that environment. And so they're really good at choking out other vegetation and just dominating the site. And really common in a lot of areas in our county. Like I said, every single person here on this call has these grasses probably in their yard or in their areas that are kind of just pasture areas or just different burrow ditches. So we just need to be mindful of those and do our best to control those. And I personally think that the best way to control those is with chemical, with some glyphosate or what is Roundup, spraying them a couple of times, as Monica said, spray them and then let that chemical terminate the plant, and then wait a couple weeks or maybe a month even, and then you'll see more green up, and then spray it one more time, and that should be enough to kill most all of that vegetation that's there. Because a lot of these grasses are really, really aggressive and frankly hard to kill. And so a lot of times one application of Roundup, it doesn't necessarily kill the entire plant. It might turn the plants brown, and it might terminate a lot of that vegetation, but those rhizomes and even in some of the roots will still send up additional plants if they aren't fully killed by the chemical, which is pretty common. And I'm not telling you, I'm not trying to sell chemical here. I'm not, but I do think there's a value at times in, a temporary use of chemical in order to prevent long-term headaches down the road, right? Getting the plot set up correctly and getting it established well and having a nice, stand established is worth it solves a lot of headaches down the road when you, instead of competing with these things for years to come, basically. So I have a few other things I'll touch on. I don't have slides for these, but I did a plot at my own property here. I did about a half acre, and it was pretty successful. And I think the reason it was successful is because I frankly learned from other people's mistakes, and I took a great deal of care in my site preparation. So I have, like I said, about a half acre. I used a 4-wheeler to do most of my site preparation and my seeding. And so what I did was in the first year, in the fall, I sprayed the entire area with Roundup, with glyphosate, to terminate everything that was currently living. And as Monica said, that glyphosate, it only really kills actively growing plants on site. So anyway, sprayed it with Roundup that fall. Let it kill everything that it could. And over the winter, I just left it over the winter. And then the following spring, I sprayed it at about May with glyphosate again to again kill all the stuff that kept coming back. And then I basically had to do that once or twice more in that first year. So think of the first year as the site was pretty bare by August. But that said, like, you will still have plants coming. If I just lose this, let's see. Did I lose my internet?
No, you're still, yeah, you're still there, Ben.
All right, cool. Sorry, my thing is closed. Yeah, so a lot of times you need to do these spraying events, 2 or 3 times over the course of a year to really clean up your site, because you will always have, these plants that didn't fully kill continuing to come back. And just because they are aggressive, and sometimes, like I said, they're not always easy to kill. So that first year, I basically just kept the site clean, made sure I didn't have any, plants growing and going to seed and creating additional hassles for me down the road. And then that fall, in November, I did what's called a Dormant Planting. And so to do that, I just went out with a seed broadcaster, and I spread my seed on the ground. And then I took my 4-wheeler and I took some chain link fence, about a 10-foot section of chain link fence, and I wrapped it around about 3 or 4 heavy posts so that it had some weight, right? And then I put a chain on that and connected it to my 4-wheeler. And then I just drove around the site for a while to churn up the soil, to scuff up the soil and mix my seeds into the soil surface. And knowing that I wasn't going to get these seeds buried, very deep, but a lot of times these pollinator seeds don't have to be planted that deep. You don't want them planted that deep. You just want some good seed to soil contact. So by driving around with a 4-wheeler and scuffing it up really good, that got some of that seed incorporated. And then the next spring, it germinated. And then along with that pollinator plot that germinated, a lot of weeds germinated. And there's no way to avoid weeds within your plot. That's just a fact of life. You're gonna have some weeds. So what's really important, if you have a site that's 100 square feet, you can a lot of times hand pull those weeds. But if you get into some of those larger sites, the 2,500 square feet or bigger, it's pretty laborious to hand pull weeds. So what I highly recommend is to mow those sites, setting your mower as high as it goes. And that will help cut the seed heads off of those annual weeds that come up and prevent them from going to seed and continuing to basically pollute your seed bank. And it doesn't harm your pollinator plants too much if you're mowing it for the first year. And it basically can eliminate some of that weed competition. So I mowed it about 2 or 3 times that first year. And then by the second year, my perennial plants had established very well. And there's still some weeds. It's impossible, like I said, to be completely weed free, but it established well, and I'm pretty happy with it. And I'm sure that I alleviated a lot of headaches by doing site prep and then controlling weeds well that first year. So then the last thing I'll do is walk you through some expectations of your plots and what you're going to see most likely in your plots over the lifespan of them. So that first year, once you plant them, in our plots, in our mixes, we have some annual species that live for 1 year. In other words, they germinate and they grow up really fast and they flower, and then they release seeds and they die basically. And those have an annual life cycle. So they rely on reseeding themselves annually. And the benefit of those plants is they come up fast and they establish and they help kind of crowd out weeds. And then we have a lot of perennial plants in that mix as well. So what you'll see is the first year, you'll see a lot of these annual flowers come up, and they're very showy and they're really great for pollinators. And then underneath them, you'll see some germination of our perennials. And the perennials, a lot of times, they may not even put up flowers that first year. They might just have rosettes on the soil surface. But the second year, those perennials tend to establish, and then they will be persistent for a longer duration. Whereas those annual flowers that come up that first year, a lot of times you'll see a ton of them that first year. You'll see a fewer of them the second year. And by the third and fourth year, a lot of times those annual flowers are kind of gone from that site because the perennial flowers have taken their place and are making it too difficult for those seeds to germinate every year, because the perennials are basically taking up the available nutrients and moisture. And basically that is, in my mind, a successful plot once those perennials have established, because they have some longevity and hopefully will persist for a number of years. I wouldn't think that on most of these plots, your lifespan on them is probably going to be somewhat finite. I wouldn't expect them to last for more than 4 or 5 years before you start to get, weed competition and grass coming in, those rhizominous grasses starting to choke it out. And, you can reduce that by hand pulling and weeding and doing various things. But competition and that encroachment is just kind of a fact of life with these pollinator species. A lot of them aren't that competitive, so they may not, like I said, may not persist for more than 4 or 5 years. But you can repeat that process as needed and replenish and replant that seed bed every 5 years or however often you might need to in order to keep it looking good. So I think there's just making sure you have some reality in terms of what the lifespan is important. It's not going to probably last forever, and that's okay, but you just need to be aware of that. I think that's all I've kind of got for now.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. To those of you that were if you're curious at all about Ben's plot, I'm sending a link in the chat right now. If you scroll down to the very bottom of that page, you can go on a little pollinator plot tour, and Ben's plot is actually in there. You can see some pictures. It really did establish nicely because of the thorough site prep that Ben did before planting. So first and foremost, thank you both to Ben and Monica for all of that information. It was really informative and thorough. So next we're going to show a brief video on another type of site prep that we've been looking into called solarization. It's potentially a really effective and passive way to prep your site. We're going to show a video that a group did on how they set up their solarization that we thought did really well. So give us just a minute here as we pull that up. And I do see the questions rolling in, you guys. Right after this video, we'll get those questions answered for you. So as we're watching this, if you have any questions, put those questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. Just 1 second as we get that video started here. Can you guys hear the video?
No, I can't.
What does that mean?
I can't hear it.
I don't have sound on the video either.
Okay, let's All right, guys, here. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. Give us 1 second really quick. I'm just going to share my screen here.
Sounds like a horror movie.
All right, so I'm pulling up the video now, and if you guys cannot hear it when it starts to play, if you'll just let me know, we might just have to skip that part.
Preparing an area for a pollinator habitat planting. Good site preparation is key to successful germination and establishment of native wildflowers. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use solarization to kill weeds and weed seeds in the topsoil before sowing wildflower seeds. Solarization uses a clear sheet of plastic laid over the ground to trap heat from the sun and kill weeds, seeds, and pathogens in the top few inches of soil. It's a safe, non-chemical approach to weed eradication that can be used in both garden and farm settings. When carried out correctly, solarization is a highly effective weed eradication technique. Before we go through the detailed step-by-step approach to using solarization, let's walk through some of the considerations when deciding whether solarization is the right tool for your planting area. Why might you choose solarization over other site preparation techniques, such as herbicide applications or repeated tillage? You might use solarization if you live in a hot, dry climate. In areas like California's Central Valley, solarization is more effective than any other weed control method, including herbicide control. In other climates, it's effective for sunny, well-drained sites. Solarization is a great option to consider if you want an organic method. You don't need to control rhizomatous, woody, or hard-seeded weeds. You have a long and narrow or small planting site. Solarization is easier and more cost-effective for sites under a half acre in size, and if you're willing to invest resources. Purchasing new UV-stabilized solarization plastic can be costly. If you have a source for used high-tunnel plastic in good condition, this can be much more affordable. Now that you know some of the considerations for how and where you might want to use solarization to prepare a site for planting, let's talk through the detailed steps of the process. Step 1. Obtain plastic. In general, solarization is best done with clear plastic rather than black plastic in order for solar radiation to penetrate into and be trapped within the top layer of the soil. The plastic needs to be thick enough to withstand breakdown by UV rays, wind, and other disturbances throughout the growing season. We recommend using UV-stabilized greenhouse polyethylene plastic with a thickness of 4 or 6 ml, which can be ordered from a variety of agricultural suppliers. Used high-tunnel plastic in good condition can be reused for solarization, reducing the total cost of the project. Make sure to repair any rips or tears with greenhouse plastic repair tape. In small areas, consider adding a second sheet of clear plastic to maximize solarization temperatures and efficacy. This option is not likely to be cost-effective for larger plantings. Step 2. Prepare the planting area for plastic. In early spring, mow and rake off existing vegetation, then disc or till the soil to create an even surface for the plastic. Loosening the soil will also help with burying the edges of the plastic. If your soil is dry, you'll want to irrigate the soil before solarizing to encourage germination of weed seeds underneath the plastic. Just before you're ready to lay down the plastic, dig a trench at least 4 inches deep around the border of the planting area. To save time, consider using a walk-behind trencher, such as a ditch witch, which can be rented from any major home and garden store. For larger plantings, trenchings can be done with a variety of tractor implements. Step 3. Lay down the plastic and bury the edges. Once the area is prepared, roll the plastic out by hand or with rolling equipment attached to a tractor or ATV. Spread the plastic out until it's taut, minimizing any air pockets at the soil surface. Place the edges of the plastic in the trench and cover with soil to bury the edges down to at least 4 inches, or enough to keep the edges buried for the time that the plastic will be on the ground. This prevents airflow underneath the plastic, which can significantly reduce the radiant heat and weed kill underneath the plastic. If there are any places where 2 pieces of plastic come together, make one trench along the seam and bury both pieces of plastic in the trench together with several inches of overlap. Make sure to get a good seal along this edge. Step 4. Perform minimal maintenance through the growing season. Check the plastic for rips and tears through the summer. If your area has abundant deer populations, be prepared for animal damage. Promptly repair any rips with greenhouse plastic repair tape. Mow around the edges of your solarization site to keep weeds around the future planting area from going to seed. Alternatively, plant an annual warm season cover crop or insectary strip mix around the edges of the plastic. Step 5. Remove the plastic in preparation for seeding. How long do you leave on the plastic? In most areas, solarization plastic should be left in place from late spring through mid-fall. In cooler climates, keep an eye out for rhizomatous weed growth under the plastic in fall and be careful not to leave it down too long. In early fall, assess any weeds remaining under the plastic. If there are aggressive perennial weeds still growing, you may need to leave the plastic on and solarize for a second season. If not, you're good to go. Before removing the plastic, pull or mow any weeds around the edges of the plastic that might rain seed into the solarized area. Roll back the plastic and set it aside for reuse or recycling. Hand pull any remaining perennial weeds or annual weeds that might drop seed into the planting area, taking care to minimize disturbance to the soil surface. Do not cultivate the soil prior to seeding, or you risk bringing up new weed seeds from below the soil surface. Take care not to spread the untreated soil used to bury the edges onto the solarized area. Step 6. Seed. The treated area should be ready to seed once the plastic is off and any remaining weeds have been removed. With effective site preparation, your native wildflowers will be able to germinate and establish without excessive competition from weeds. We hope you've learned enough to put solarization to the test as you prepare areas for pollinator habitat in your home garden or on your farm. Let us know your experience in the comments. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date as we post new videos on pollinator habitat, bee research, and more. Visit our website at www.projecticp.org. Thanks.
All right. So we'll go ahead and move into questions here.
For watching.
Whoa. All right. So we have a couple questions here in the Q&A. So Ben and Monica, as you guys feel like you know the answer, feel free to just pop in and answer them. So Melanie asked if Roundup is a controversial chemical.
I'll just go ahead and jump in on this one. You've probably heard a lot about Roundup in the news recently. And a lot of that is due to the long-term or repeated exposure to a chemical like Roundup. And I would just say with any chemical, if you're going to use it, you just absolutely need to look at the label for any sort of warnings or hazards. You need to follow any safety requirements. A lot of them will ask you to wear gloves, eye protection, long sleeve shirts, and such like that. As far as chemicals go, all chemicals are going to have a risk, but Roundup as a herbicide is probably the least harmful that we have. I guess as far as environmental harm or human health harm, but again, it all depends on the dose and the exposure and the repeated exposure. So just definitely read the label.
Thank you.
I'll just add one thing. I'll just say with Roundup, I hear a lot of people oftentimes tell me that they don't want to use Roundup or glyphosate because they don't want to hurt their soil or they're worried about their soil health. And so then instead of using Roundup, person tills repeatedly in order to do their site prep. And I guess I'm not telling you you should use chemical, but I would say, like, from a soil health perspective, I think that repeated soil disturbance with tillage is probably a lot worse than what Roundup causes to your soil health with a few applications. And I think I personally think, like, depending on how big your site is, like, the benefits of glyphosate might outweigh the risks, at least in my opinion, just because you know, it's hard to do site prep on a large site. You saw the solarization, video, and that is, it's great. But once you get a larger site, like, your hands are kind of tied, right? You're kind of limited. So I kind of say, like, a couple applications of Roundup to give yourself, a long-term, longer term successful planting is maybe better than fighting weeds for years and years, kind of deal. But it's a personal choice, no doubt.
All right, thank you to you both. Let's see, someone's asking the recommendation on a mix for the Roundup application.
I would just say follow label requirements. Just read the label, and it's pretty clear on that label. When you read it, and there's different formulations, because a lot of times Roundup is sold. It's glyphosate, and so Roundup is the product name from the patent, but the patent expired, and so now Roundup glyphosate can be sold via a lot of different products out there. Are glyphosate. So just read the label.
Awesome. Let's see. Someone's wondering if you could review the types of implements helpful to planting pollinator plot using a small tractor or ATV.
Sure. One of the implements that I think would be really helpful is something to loosen up the soil a little bit. If you had a disc or something on there that you could, if there's any compaction, and if you've sprayed weeds, or if you're trying to remove those roots, you're going to be able to just lightly create a little soil disturbance so that you can remove the roots of the weeds and then get your seed in the ground. And I think that's probably one of the most helpful. And then also, if you can get a little broadcast seeder, those are really helpful. And then, like Ben was talking about, you can get creative with the tools and the equipment you have around your place. Like he was using with the chains and wrapping it around some fence posts to just help firm your soil and help incorporate that seed. And I also want to mention too, if you do have a little tractor, there are some places that have drill seeders that you can borrow or rent. Some conservation districts do. And then also you check with your local Pheasants Forever office, because sometimes different regions will have drill seeders available for use as well.
Yeah, so the Lake County Conservation District, they do have a no-till drill. It's an 8-foot drill, and that's great if you're planting something in the scale of, a couple of acres or more. You need a 50-horse tractor to use it, but it's a pretty easy to use piece of equipment, and they rent it for about $100 a day. And again, in my case, I used I had a sprayer on the back of my ATV just with a wand, and then I just, used what I had, and I just rolled that chain link fence up. But a simple little, 8-foot section of harrow would be really good too, to use instead of like a chain link. It'd be a little better. I wouldn't go out personally and like buy a disc for my ATV, because those are kind of expensive. And depending on your soil, you may or may not need it, depending on how you're doing your site prep. For the most part, it's pretty straightforward. And then the weed district here, Lake County Weed District, also rents spraying equipment as well. So like that fits in the back of your truck, I think. And then they have some maybe pull behind ones that you could pull with an ATV. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do know they rent spraying equipment also.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, if anyone's interested in that no-till drill, you can find out more information on our website. Someone's asking about the deer, and they were wondering if you could remind them on the recommendations for discouraging grazing on pollinator plots.
So yeah, in our county, deer are a problem depending on where you are. And a lot of times, as any gardener knows, sometimes it doesn't depend how many deer you have. It depends on how often that single deer comes and creates a problem, because one deer on a small plot can give you a lot of headaches. They're a little difficult to work with for sure and to deal with. A couple of options with deer. First off, you can build a large fence, tall fence around it, but you got to be like 6 or 7 feet tall to prevent them from jumping in. Or another option would be to do an offset fence, which is basically 2 electric fences that are separated by like 3 feet. And so the first fence, and I'm not 100% sure, Monica, if you know the answer to this, jump in. That first fence, you set like 4 feet tall, like a 1 or 2 poly wires or hot wires. And then the second fence, you set like 4 feet off of it or 3 feet off of it. And then that would be like about 3 feet high, because what the deer don't like is to jump a span of that distance and have to clear that height. And they don't want to, they can't really jump in between and then jump again. So you want to set the fence so they can't clear it in one jump. And that can kind of persuade them from going in there as well. And it's a little less costly than a big fence.
Awesome. And then the last question is, I heard you say that you can plant pollinator seeds in the fall or the spring. Is there a recommendation of which season is best?
They both work really well. So the late fall planting, again, you're trying to do a dormant fall planting. So after October 15th, you don't want your seed to germinate. So sometimes you can plant later into November or December, as long as your ground's not frozen, or early spring. So before May 15th. And I think really a lot of it goes back to, when can you get your site prep done? So a lot of people are doing site prep in the fall, and then they want to do one more site prep, so controlling the weeds again in the early spring when they're germinating before they seed, and that works really well. But either timing for getting the seeds in the ground will work well.
Totally agree. In our county, I'd say on that dormant planting, because we tend to have pretty long and often warmer falls here. I tend to try to get my dormant plantings in like after November 1st, or like kind of like late October and early November, because you just never know in our area, if you're going to get like a warm up or something in late October, and then for some reason they all germinate and they can frost kill on you. But I had very good success with fall plantings here. I kind of is my preference, but I think either works really well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to our speakers. It was really great to learn the ins and outs of site prep and get all of your knowledge on everything that we talked about. And thank you to everyone that joined us. And thanks for bearing with our technical issues there. We really appreciate you guys joining us. Make sure to check out our website for more information about the Pollinator Initiative and our other programs. And we'll be signing off, but thanks again, you guys.